Hey guys, so I wanted to do something different for today's video. I decided to head outside to continue building the video learning platform I've been working on. So this is a Node.js course that I took on Udemy several years ago. I pulled this up to give you guys a general idea on what I want to implement today. I'm going to be doing this side navigation that has the sections for a course, and inside each section you have subsections, which are videos themselves that have the name of the subsection or video and the video's length, and then you have a video player on the left hand side. And what I want to show under the video, instead of this stuff, I'm going to be rendering some markdown so that I can include supplementary information for the videos as well as code snippets. To build this, I'm using sveltekit for the UI, Supabase for my database, the Drizzle ORM to read and write to the database, and I'm going to be using Vimeo to stream the videos, as it's a pretty straightforward solution, though I might look into other options in the future. Before I jump into writing code, I want to show you guys what the database currently looks like. I have a course table for the video courses. A course has many different sections, as well as a slug, which we'll be using to construct the URLs. A slug is a good idea for human readable and SEO friendly URLs. These are random words that I generated with Faker. As you can see here, these sections in a course will also have their own names, as well as a slug. I'm going to open these in a sub view. And then you can see here that a section will also have subsections. So if I click here, you can see these subsections. And each subsection will have a Vimeo video ID that corresponds to the video we want to show for that subsection. We also have the video's length in seconds, as well as a slug for the URLs. And I'm going to go ahead and open up a new terminal window. I'm going to attach to a tmux session I've been using to work on my personal site, which is where I'm going to be implementing this. I'll start up the development server and also Drizzle Studio, which is what I was using earlier to show you guys the data in the database. Finally, I'll open up NeoVim. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to add the routes that I need to implement these new pages. Alright, so under the routes directory, I've added a courses route, which inside will have a dynamic route that will have the value of the course slug. Same goes for the section, and same goes for the subsection. Then inside of subsection slug, I have a page.svelte file, which we'll use to render the UI for a given subsection. I'm going to go back to Drizzle Studio here. So as you can see here, I have a subsection called Frost. It belongs to a section called Multicolored, and Multicolored belongs to a course called Advancement. So over here, I can do Advancement / Multicolored / Frost. I also have to add courses here. Nice. So the page is empty. Now we're going to start filling it up. I want to show the side navigation for every subsection of a course, so I'm going to use a layout to do this. So I've added a layout.svelte file, which we'll use to render the side navigation. And this layout.server.ts file will allow us to query the database for the data that we need. It's a .server.ts file because we only want to run code that accesses the database on the server. I'm going to go ahead and write the code that we need to access the data. Alright, so I've added the code to query the database. We export a load function here so that the layout.svelte file can access this data. I'm using a DB client for Drizzle. I want to query for a course and only get one. And I'm using a where clause to make sure that the course that I get has a slug equal to the course slug that is in the URL. Then I only want to get these two columns, and I want to include the course's sections with these columns, and finally also include the subsections with these columns. Then at the bottom, I return the course data. I'm going to open up the layout.svelte file. It's the one under subsection slug. And now I can implement the code to actually render the data. Alright, so I've added the code to render the UI. The first thing I do here is define this data variable, which we can use to access the data that gets passed to the layout from the layout.server.ts file. As you can see here, it has a course. Then down here, I'm accessing the course property. You'll see that it can be undefined. So when I'm rendering the UI, I want to check if it's defined first. If it is, we'll create the side navigation that'll have a list inside. We loop through these sections of a course, render each section name, and then have a nested list where we loop through the subsections of a section. And for each subsection, we'll have a link that will take us to that subsection's page. You'll see here in the href that we're using these slugs to construct this URL. And we want to show the subsection name, and if it has a video length, we also want to show the video length. And I'm using a custom function that I defined for formatting the length in seconds into a nice human readable format. I've opened up the browser again, back to the page we were looking at earlier for Advancement Multicolored Frost, and you'll see here that we'll have the multicolored section, all of its subsections, and the video lengths, so on and so forth. I've gone ahead and added some styling and icons to it to make it look a lot nicer. I'm using Tailwind for this. I want to keep this video focused on the logic and rendering of the UI rather than the styling. If you want to take a closer look, I'll have the code available in my repo linked in the description. So now that I added all the styling, this is how it looks like. One thing I want to change here is that I want the current active section to be highlighted the same as when you hover over it. So I'm going to go ahead and implement that now. Alright, so I just finished implementing this. What I did was to access the page svelte store, which has a params property that allows us to access the parameters in the URL. And over here, I'm destructuring it to get access to the section slug and the subsection slug. Note that I'm using a $sign here to make this reactive so that whenever the page changes, these values change as well. Now down here, I've added a variable here called section active that will only be true if in the current iteration of the loop, section.slug is equal to the section slug from the URL. Then I modify the styling if it is true. Down here, I do the same thing for subsections, and I modify the styling if subsection active is true. Now you can see here that we have multicolored frost. So multicolored is white and frost is highlighted as well. If I click on this one and the URL changes, it gets highlighted as active now. And down here, if I change to a different section, so we're going to and let's click on interview, then now both and the interview subsection are highlighted. Now what I want to do next is to embed a video player for each subsection to show its video. To do this, I need to add a new file. I'm going to open the File Explorer, and under subsection slug, I need to add a file here that's called page.server.ts. With this file, we can query the database for the data that we need for a specific subsection and be able to use that to render the UI. I'm going to go ahead and implement this to query the database for the data for the current subsection. Alright, so again, I'm exporting a load function so that we can pass this data to the page. I'm using drizzle to query the database for a subsection and using a where clause to find the subsection that matches the slug in the URL. I'm getting the columns that I need, and I'm returning the subsection to pass it to the page. Now I can go ahead and navigate to subsection_slug/page.svelte and implement what I need to render the video. So I've added the code that I need to access the subsection data. I'm just exporting this data variable, and the type is page data. You'll see that it has access to the data from the layout as well as the subsection that we just queried from the database in page.server.ts. I'm defining a variable for it, and then I check if it's defined because it can be undefined before we render any data. Now I need to get the Vimeo iframe code. I have a sample video here that I'm going to be using for this. I've added this ID to subsections in the database. If I go over here to the database and click on subsections here, you'll see that this ID that ends in 8419 is the same one as this one here, 8419. How this will work in the future is that you can set the video as hidden, and then you can change the embed settings so that you can only embed it inside of a specific domain. I'm just going to leave this as anywhere for now so we can see this video on my local running server. So I'm going to go to embed, and I'm going to copy this code right here. I'm going to go ahead and copy it. Alright, so I added the code for the iframe here to show the Vimeo video player, and what I did was to use a template string, and I'm using the Vimeo video ID so that the player can show the correct video, and I'm setting the title to the subsection's name. I've opened up the project again. We're not seeing it right now because of a styling issue. If I scroll down, you can see it right here. I'm gonna go ahead and fix that. Alright, so I've gone ahead and fixed it, and you can see now that it's showing on the right hand side. I'm using a flexbox container to show the nav and the main content side by side. Down here where we have the slot, which is where the content of the page will be rendered, I'm using a container with flex1 so that it grows to take up the remaining space. I'm using a special component for page transitions here. You can take a look at the code for this in the repo, and I add some final styling for the main content. If I click on another subsection here, you'll see the page transition and everything looks pretty good. Now the final thing I want to implement is to render the markdown for a specific subsection. How this will work is that I have a directory here under src called markdown that has a courses directory, and inside the file structure will be according to slugs. So this is the slug for a specific course. I added this one according to the data that we're currently using. This is the one for the section, and then down here we have two markdown files for two different subsections. If I click on one of these, you'll see that it's just markdown, and it's going to be for these two. I'm already using MD-Specs in this project, which allows me to render markdown in a sveltekit project. You can see how I set that up in the repo. For this video, I'm just going to add the logic that I need to be able to render the markdown for each subsection. To make this work, I have to add a new file under subsection slug. It's going to be called page.ts. This is also used to pass data to the page, but it will run both in the server and the browser. I'm going to go ahead and write the code I need for this. Alright, so I've added a load function here, and I define a variable that will store a svelte component for the markdown. Over here I'm using a Vite dynamic import to get the markdown file for this subsection. To do this, I'm using the slugs for the course, the section, and the subsection according to the file structure I just showed you, and all of this is in a try-catch block because a subsection might not have a markdown file, and we don't want to throw an error if this happens. Then down here we return the markdown component by accessing the default property. I'm using the question mark syntax here because markdown can be undefined. Now finally, I also have to return the data from page.server.ts so that it's still accessible in the page. Alright, so now we have access to this data variable. Load functions have access to this. This will have the subsection that gets returned from page.server.ts, and we return it here. Now I can go to subsection slug page.svelte, and I can add the code that I need to render the markdown. Alright, so now I've destructured data so that we can access the subsection data as well as the markdown svelte component. And then down here, I check if it's defined. If it is, I add an article tag. I have a copy code injector that will inject a copy code button to each code block in the markdown. Again, you can take a look at this code in the repo. And then I use the markdown svelte component to render the markdown. If I go to the browser and I scroll down here, you can see the markdown. I'm just going to add some Tailwind classes that will make it really easy to style this. Alright, so I've added these classes to the article tag. I'm making use of a Tailwind plugin called Typography to be able to use this prose class, which can automatically style the markdown. And I'm using prose invert for dark mode. Now if I go back to the browser and scroll down, you can see now that the markdown looks a lot nicer. If we change to frost, then we get the markdown for that instead. And that's it, you guys, we're done. So to give you a summary, this is the side navigation. If you click on a subsection, it'll get highlighted and it'll show its video and markdown, and it'll also be compatible with light mode. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with more content like this from me. See you guys in the next one. Peace.